It is 1919, and the map of Europe is being redrawn in the wake of the Great War, especially in the lands of the now former Austro-Hungarian Empire. In particular contention is the issue of their former territories on the Adriatic coast, including the city of Fiume. Italian nationalists are furious about the matter, and on the 12th of September 1919, Italian poet, war hero, aviator, and journalist Gabriele D'Annunzio seizes the city with a ragtag group of paramilitaries, deserters, and veterans, claiming it for Italy, much to the displeasure of the Italian government. Prior to the Great War, Italy had been in a purely defensive alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and as such were under no obligation to join in once the war began. However, in 1915, Italy was given an offer by the Entente to join the war on their side against Italy's former allies, with the promise of a variety of territories to be gained from them after the end of the war. This was accepted, and Italy entered into the conflict. To say the war didn't go well for the Italians would be something of an understatement. Their army ended up mired in a stalemate with Austro-Hungarian forces, fighting across the river Isonzo and high up in the mountains of the Alps, ultimately suffering more than 500,000 dead, more than 3% of their population at the time. And worse still, only some of the land promised to Italy for joining the war would be received, as much of it was instead given to the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, a country which is rather easier to call Yugoslavia. The reason for this was partly due to their own lack of success during the war, and partly because of the influence of US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, calling for the new Italian border to be drawn along lines of nationality. Italian nationalists were furious about this mutilated victory, and the inaction of the government, which was preoccupied with domestic chaos, only inflamed them further. Chief among these men was Gabriele D'Annunzio, a colourful character famous for his decadent poetry and daring exploits, most notably his flight over Vienna, where he dropped thousands of propaganda leaflets, many of them handwritten, from a plane over the Austro-Hungarian capital, hundreds of miles behind the front line. He was also popularly associated with the elite assault troops of the Arditi. Throughout the early part of 1919, D'Annunzio would give fiery speeches in Rome on the question of Dalmatia and the city of Fiume. Fiume lies on the east coast of the northern Adriatic, and it was an important port city with a long history, stretching back to even before the days of the Roman Empire. By the start of the 20th century, it had been ruled by the von Habsburgs, of Austrian and Hungarian fame, for almost 450 years. The population of the city by this time was rather mixed, with no single group making up a majority of the population. Italians were the single largest group, followed by Croats, Slovenes, Hungarians, and Germans, with a smattering of others, mostly from other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. With the end of the Great War, the city was not actually assigned to anyone by any treaty, but due to the mixed population, both Italians and Yugoslavs felt they had a claim to it, creating two separate national councils in the city, one Italian and one Croatian, both of which unilaterally declared the city to have been annexed into both Italy and Yugoslavia respectively. The Yugoslav army would briefly occupy the city, before being replaced by a coalition of Entente forces, made up of Italian, French, British, and American contingents, awaiting a final decision on the fate of the city. During this time, the tense situation in Fiume would only worsen, with attacks on Croatians and French soldiers who were seen as being pro-Yugoslav, culminating in a clash between Italian soldiers and French soldiers, leading to the deaths of 9 Frenchmen. In response, the police were put under British command, the Italian National Council was dissolved, and the Italian troops involved were withdrawn, particularly the Sardinian Grenadiers, who would be sent to the nearby Italian town of Ronchi di Monfalcone. Their disgruntled officers would send D'Annunzio a letter, asking him to support their cause to bring Fiume under Italian rule. D'Annunzio received this letter at the start of September 1919, and promised to join them and lead them to Fiume on the 7th. However, he fell suddenly ill with the flu, and so it was only on the 11th that he, still recovering, actually arrived in Ronchi with a small party of army officers. He met with the commander of the Grenadiers, who agreed to lead his troops into the city, and he had 25 trucks and 5 armoured cars requisitioned for them to travel in. Finally, on the morning of the 12th of September, 1919, D'Annunzio set off for Fiume from the town of Ronchi with 200 soldiers of the Sardinian Grenadiers, and as they travelled, they would be joined by other military units, including Bersaglieri and Arditi, and eventually the Fiume Legion. By the time they reached the city, the number of these so-dubbed legionnaires had swelled to more than 2,500. At the edge of the city, their advance was halted by the commander of the Italian forces in Fiume, General Pittaluga, who had been ordered by the Italian government to halt D'Annunzio's march. Face to face with him, D'Annunzio opened his coat and presented his chest of medals, daring Pittaluga to order his men to shoot him, stating that that would be all it would take to stop him. Unwilling to do so, he let D'Annunzio and his column pass by him and enter into the city. After a few more unsuccessful attempts to stop him, D'Annunzio took the governor's palace and announced to the gathered crowd that Fiume was now part of Italy. The Italian government was, to say the least, displeased with the developments in Fiume, and they attempted to suppress the situation by demanding that those who joined the march return, lest they be declared deserters. This was, however, ignored, and the city would be placed under a blockade, with the baffled international contingents deciding to leave. The new de facto city-state needed to find supporters for their cause, and here entered a man you will have probably heard of, an associate of D'Annunzio and editor of the Milanese newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia, Benito Mussolini. In just 3 years' time, he would be the leader of a new fascist Italy, but at this time, he was practically D'Annunzio's PR man. Just 4 days after his march, D'Annunzio sent Mussolini a scathing letter, criticising the lack of support he and others were providing the legionnaires of Fiume. Mussolini would publish this letter, with the parts critical of him removed of course, and he began a massive fundraising campaign that would quickly raise more than 3 million lira, around $4 million today. Other support for the city came in the form of a ship full of weaponry, intended for the White Army in the ongoing Russian Civil War, which was diverted to the city by a sympathetic Union leader, and also an influx of soldiers from other units on the border, who deserted to join the legionnaires. By the end of October, elections had been held, with a landslide victory for those in favour of joining Italy. Needless to say, the Italian government was becoming rather unnerved by the developments in Fiume, and so they sent them an offer. They would ensure the city did not become part of Yugoslavia, but they would not annex the city themselves, at least until the treaties had been sorted out. D'Annunzio was furious at the offer of anything less than an Italian Fiume, and he rejected it outright. But a member of the city government spread the news around the city, forcing the matter to a vote, which was passed by the council, much to the displeasure of D'Annunzio, whose supporters then demanded a popular vote. The vote was marked by violence, but the results were clearly in favour of the motion, and so D'Annunzio voided the results on account of the violence, which he blamed on himself, and stated that he would make the ultimate decision, and he of course rejected it. This led to a collapse of effective government in the city, which would continue until the 12th of August 1920, when D'Annunzio stood on the balcony of the governor's palace and declared Fiume an independent state, to be called the Italian Regency of Carnaro. The charter of this new state truly exemplified the general atmosphere of Fiume during the whole period. The charter itself has been called everything from anarchist and libertarian to democratic and fascist, and in truth, the answer is somewhere in between all of them at once. It included universal suffrage and equal pay for both men and women, equality for all citizens regardless of their background, as well as free education and freedom of speech, and pensions for both disability and age. The charter even decriminalised nudity, homosexuality, and drug use. The economy was organised along corporatist lines, a system inspired by medieval guilds that would later be adopted by Mussolini in Italy. The city would be praised and visited by innumerable intellectuals and political radicals from across Europe and the world, including such names as Marconi and Toscanini. All kinds of ideas could be found in the city that was now becoming known for wild partying. There were legionnaires being taught yoga by Guido Keller and karate by Harakichi Shimoi. The city would be proclaimed to be truly futurist, forging a brand new world. D'Annunzio would attempt to create an anti-League of Nations called the League of Fiume, which was intended to destroy the world order and champion the causes of those oppressed and wronged by the victorious powers, including, but not limited to, the Italians, Croatians, Albanians, Germans, Catalans, Maltese, Irish, Indians, Hawaiians, Chinese, Arabs, Russians, Romanians, Turks, and even the Pope, along with the Chinese and black populations of America. Irish nationalists would attempt to buy weapons in Fiume, and Fiume would recognise an independent Ireland before the British. They would even be the first state to recognise the fledgling Soviet Union, with D'Annunzio receiving a box of caviar from Lenin himself. But all the chaotic absurdity of D'Annunzio's city-state was not to last. On the 12th of November 1920, Italy and Yugoslavia would finalise the Treaty of Rapallo, where they pledged to respect the independence of the Free State of Fiume. D'Annunzio once again rejected this compromise out of hand, and sent legionnaires to occupy several nearby Yugoslav islands. That December, he was given an ultimatum, demanding he and his legionnaires leave the city and islands and accept the treaty. Ignoring all deadlines, he readied himself and his troops for war. The events that followed became known as Bloody Christmas. The Italian troops launched their attack on the 24th of December 1920, the date probably chosen to minimise outrage in Italy, and they were fought off by the legionnaires. And after a truce on Christmas Day, the Italian battleships Andrea Doria and Duilio began shelling the governor's palace and other targets. D'Annunzio would surrender and accept the treaty on the 29th. The brief war left 25 Italian soldiers dead, along with 26 legionnaires and 7 civilians. D'Annunzio and his legionnaires would leave the city in January, marking the end of the Fiume Endeavour. Fiume would become the Free State of Fiume, with pro-autonomy candidates elected to run it, though they would be overthrown in March 1922 by Italian nationalists, before the city was annexed by the new fascist Italy under Mussolini in 1924. D'Annunzio retreated to a grand villa in Lombardy, where he would spend the rest of his life, mostly involved in literary pursuits and the transformation of his home into a representation of the deeds of himself and Italian soldiers during the Great War. Despite his influence on Mussolini and his politics, he was now overshadowed by him, with Mussolini ensuring he stayed out of politics with a large stipend for the poet, which he enjoyed until his death in 1938. Italy would lose Fiume to Yugoslavia after the end of the Second World War, with the vast majority of its Italian inhabitants killed, expelled, or encouraged to leave. This bizarre and comic event, though often forgotten, marked the beginning of the end for the treaties established after the end of the First World War, even as they were still being written. It has also been put forwards as the birthplace of fascism, a force that would define the decades following the events in Fiume. Thanks for watching the video, and if you've enjoyed it or found it informative, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, or sharing it elsewhere for more like this in the future.